Throughout this course, we have learned much about the economy of India and Mexico and how trade was first conducted. Initially, trade routes were created primarily by sea, making for long, treacherous journeys in order to transport goods and people. However, during the mid 19th century and early 20th century, India and Mexico introduced new routes via land thanks to steam engine powered trains. This was an economic game changer on a global scale. Business was now able to take place in areas that previously was made impossible. People were now able to travel to new destinations, causing change politically, economically, and socially. India's construction of railroads occurred during British colonialism, while Mexico's began post-colonialism. There are striking similarities between the two. Chatter of building a railroad in India began towards the beginning of the 19th century, but was not formally approved by the East India Company until 1845. There were six main concerns about taking on such an enormous project that caused for the hesitation, all of which were due to the harsh terrain and weather conditions in the region. Initially, the estimate of workers needed to complete the task was 10,000. However, by 1863, up to 45,000 men had been employed. The British exploited Indian workers while they reaped all the rewards. British hoped to achieve two main goals from the addition of the railroad, one of which was facilitating the deployment of officials and military resources, and the second was the transport of goods including raw materials and produce destined for export. The British planned to isolate the use of the railroad for these sole purposes, excluding the very people who built it from benefiting from its use. Attaining funds for such a large-scale project required for creative policies to be put in place so that it would involve no cost to Britain. The construction of Indian railroads posed to be the most significant investment program in the history of the British Empire. Off-balance sheet government guarantees to private rail companies was the main tactic in financing. This meant that Indian taxpayers were funding the railroad they were being forced to build. In other words, laborers were paying to work. The way in which the British went about funding the railroads greatly reduced costs for them, but led to consequences for laborers and the overall country. Railroad construction caused grain price inflation, which led to serious starvation across India. Indian laborers were thrust into brutal working and living conditions. You can see in these photos of the construction of the Bengal-Nagpur Railway, the terrain was extremely harsh and treacherous. Workers had to maneuver through big rocky valleys, hills, deserts, thick forests, using less than safe methods such as these questionable propped-up wooden bridges. There were many physical obstacles in the way, so workers had to construct many tunnels through these rocky valleys using tools seen here, as well as blowing their way through using dynamite. Laborers lived in largely overcrowded groups in small huts along the construction sites. This made workers prone to diseases, famine, and exhaustion. The elevated tracks that ran through these overpopulated villages caused even more hygiene issues as water began to build up in unnatural areas rather than draining properly. Therefore, clean water was a problem, and within the first 10 years of construction, over 2,000 died from cholera alone. By the beginning of the 20th century, India had the fourth largest rail network in the world. As expected, economy and trade increased at an amazing rate, allowing for cheaper and more efficient transportation, as well as a much more unified and fair pricing of goods across India. Railways accounted for the majority of economic growth in India and was a major success for the British. However, there were some unintended outcomes due to this new efficient way of travel. The British did not expect natives to use this railway to their advantage, but they were wrong, and Indians began exploring the new areas of the subcontinent at an exponential rate. The ability for Indians from different regions to unify was previously impossible, but thanks to the British, there was now a sense of nationalism amongst their colonized people. They learned of the widespread oppression, including social class and caste divides. Obviously, a sense of unification among the people alone was not enough to make a significant change, but it gave Gandhi the tools he needed to do so. Even he was thrown off one of these trains, which led to the start of protesting and in turn eventually ended the British Raj. Unlike India, Mexican railroad construction began post-colonialism under President Diaz. Even though Mexico is now an independent nation, similar methods of exploitation and problems arose. Although Mexico was free of colonialism, they did not have political or financial stability that other powerful nations had. Geographically, Mexico was in a unique position, bordering the United States, which had a flourishing economy and serious influence. The United States took advantage of their superior position and formed a relationship with Mexico and Diaz. Funding for Mexican railroads came primarily from foreign investors, including the US and Britain, in return for allowing Mexico to get a foot in the door of the newly prospering capitalistic market. The Mexican government, under control of Diaz, subsidized about a third of construction costs. Since foreign countries were now funding the railroads, in a way, Mexico was being told what to do by foreigners rather than regulating themselves. Although this helped spark Mexico's economy, this led to an extremely similar version of colonialism and exploitation. Just like India, the vast rugged terrain was now able to be traveled efficiently. From 893 kilometers of track at the end of 1879, Mexico's rail system expanded to 19,205 kilometers by 1910. This allowed for the transport and, in particular, exportation of goods, opening up more jobs and a more stable economy. Although Mexican workers were not under the rule of a colonizing power, they were subject to similar abuse under the dictatorship of Diaz. Working conditions were poor, and as you can see from the pictures, the terrain was harsh and dry in most areas. Laborers were overworked and undercompensated. In fact, they were not paid at all in most cases. Diaz tried to guilt Mexican workers into free labor as they were doing a greater good for their country, and they were being paid in return for the prosper the railways would bring to their country in the end. Like in India, there was a created sense of unity amongst the people, and they began pushing back, and Diaz was forced to give more to workers, but only foreign workers earned more than the minimum required for living. Eventually, this turned into the Mexican Revolution, and they were able to overthrow the wrath Diaz's dictatorship brought. Railroads were utilized by revolutionists and served multifaceted purposes. Fighters used the trains for protection, transportation, and even as a weapon, since they sometimes attached explosives to moving trains. A unification of a nation via railroads allowed for natives to end their oppression. This resulted in the fall of the Diaz dictatorship in 1911, and revolutionary turmoil that ensued put an end to railroad construction and caused considerable damage. Railroads in both India and Mexico were created for the benefit of foreign powers and greedy rulers. These new routes of transportation made lasting changes economically, socially, and politically, but most importantly, brought people together for the betterment of their countries.